Roll call, roll call, please.
1 second.
You said we were ready.
Commissioner Chalet. Commissioner Stringer,
Here.
Commissioner Knack,
Here.
Commissioner Whitehouse,
Here.
Commissioner McCaffrey,
Here.
Chair Sarter.
Here. Any staff, any additions or deletions from the agenda tonight?
No additions tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Byrd. Anyone from the public wish to speak on any non-agenda items? Thank you, Melissa. Did anyone have any questions or any errors or anything to point out with the minutes? No questions on them? Okay, we can approve them together. So do I have a motion to approve the minutes from both the November 4th and the work session from December 9th?
So moved.
Second. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Stringer,
Yes.
Commissioner Knack,
Yes.
Commissioner Whitehouse,
Yes.
Commissioner McCaffrey,
Yes.
Chair Sarter.
Yes. Okay, we'll move on to new business, the draft housing needs and affordability assessment. Staff has a quick introduction and then we'll get into the presentation. Mr. Byrd.
Thank you, Chairman Sarter. Cody Bird, Planning Director, and we have guests with us tonight, Christian Karen and Mike. Mike, I'm sorry, I forgot the last name. James, thank you. Mike James from Matrix Design Group, our consultants on this project. The Planning Commission has seen drafts of this, and we've discussed it in the work session in December. So you've seen the latest revisions on that. I wanted to go over just a kind of a quick recap on what it is we're doing and the why. Some of it's self-evident from the report and the numbers that you're seeing, but I thought it was also good to ground it in some of the other community contexts. So this is a complete housing needs assessment. We're looking at the existing housing inventory, community income levels to help identify where are we at in terms of affordability, where are we at in terms of total housing units, what's our composition of rental versus owner occupied, and what does all of that mean in terms of overall community affordability for our residents. And that helps inform our processes for what we can do from a regulatory standpoint to help close the gap on meeting affordability and housing needs. It helps us identify where programmatic incentives may be helpful in terms of reducing or right-sizing impact fees, waiver of fees for qualifying projects. All of those financial components can be considered at a later date as well, but it does help quantify where the overall needs are in terms of housing affordability. I wanted to highlight a couple of the things that, and we probably could have discussed easily at the last work session, but I was reminded of it. We have goals specifically in our comprehensive plan that touch on these topics. Goal number 2 for community cohesion is ensure that existing and future residential development contribute to enhancing quality of life. And that has several strategies associated with it, including allowing a greater mix of housing types and styles that cater to a variety of families, including older adults, first-time home buyers, low-income earners, and people with disabilities, among others. Very salient for the conversation in this HNA, housing needs assessment. Another strategy is to support Housing Catalyst in their mission to provide affordable housing. Housing Catalyst is the nonprofit group that administers the Wellington Housing Authority goals and efforts and manages their housing inventory. So Housing Catalyst is a strategic partner for the community for housing affordability. And another strategy is to identify incentives to encourage new housing developments and retrofits that include energy efficient and water wise materials and practices while ensuring homes are both affordable and cost comparable. I think that cost comparable component was where are we at in the marketplace of the greater region, not just in terms of Wellington standards. And then there's also a goal for developing a supportive business environment that aids in creating a thriving local economy. And that includes balancing residential and commercial land uses to promote local job opportunities and needed services for residents. So a lot of our conversations and some recent development proposals highlighted the need to focus on both residential and commercial and bring those two forward to make cohesive neighborhoods instead of just all of one type and none of the other. And I also wanted to highlight a topic that this Planning Commission hasn't discussed independent of other conversations, but the the Board of Trustees adopts a 2-year strategic plan that guides their efforts and highlights key projects that they're focused on. And in their 2-year strategic plan that's in effect now includes goals of growing responsibly, including improving housing diversity and exploring financing options for development. And that's kind of a high level term, but all the tools in the toolbox to achieve good development. And fostering economic vibrancy, which includes recruiting new businesses. That could be new home builders, that could be new developers, it could be new commercial aspects, and all the things that both are needed to bring those things forward. So it's clear in the comprehensive plan for the community and our board's strategic plan that this housing needs assessment is on point for several of the goals to help achieve the town's current vision. And I think it's also helpful to remind ourselves of who we're doing this for. Obviously, Wellington residents, our homeowners, our renters, are the folks that are impacted by the housing supply, inventory, and affordability. This housing needs assessment digs into what's our population, what's that makeup, what are their specific needs, what are their income levels, so that we can selectively target certain area median income percentages to help make those units more affordable for those who need that affordable consideration. And I think it's really important to frame this in the context of we need these goals and strategies to help represent our residents of today and our residents of tomorrow and the future. These housing affordability is a systemic challenge. It's not one that has a single solution or a silver bullet. It's a process of iterative approaches, continually looking at how do we address these concerns and make sure that we keep going back and looking at what's working, what's not working, how do we adapt and change to meet the future needs as well as today's needs. So I wanted to help frame, kind of reinforce why we're doing this in the first place. This effort is grant funded. We received funding from the Department of Local Affairs to help make this project possible. So we're fortunate to have that support. And I'll probably keep this kind of light, but I thought there might be a few things that would help once we get into discussions on probably mostly discussions on strategies. Some things that might help frame our planning commissioners through that discussion. So reminder, when we get into these, we're taking a very high level planning view of these topics right now. We know that housing affordability is a big topic. There's not a one size fits all solution. What you see in the draft report, there's multiple strategies that are identified. Probably all of them or some combination of them is going to be needed to truly affect changes. Progress is going to require a lot of time. These don't happen overnight. One solution doesn't solve it, and it's going to take an iterative approach, as I mentioned. So when you're looking at strategies, think high level. What are we going to do to move the needle? And then staff, planning commission, board of trustees are going to continue to chip away to make incremental progress on those strategies. For tonight, we're probably focusing on identifying the needs, the community engagement feedback, and what those high-level strategies are. There's not going to be a need to dive too deep into, individual plots. If we draw a house with this dimension, what lot size or lot width is needed to meet that need, and will that work in a pro forma to make sure it pencils out? Those aren't the topics that we're really digging into tonight. It's a little bit higher level on what are the strategies. And something that came up in the last work session that I thought was kind of a challenge. We know that when we dive into these topics, they all affect individual people and households, very personally. It's easy to use a personal scenario or example that can be used to illustrate why we're looking at these things, but the very minute specifics of an individual set of scenarios is more germane to that person than it is representative of the community as a whole. And so I would caution utilizing personal circumstances too heavily because it's not representative of the whole community. It kind of leaves you open to forgetting that there's other portions of the population that are not being represented by individual circumstances, and it can inadvertently leave whole populations out of the bigger picture. So it's easy to fall into the trap and to get into those specifics, but I'd caution you to kind of help keep it up, help others keep it up at a higher level for the conversations for the community as a whole. So I wanted to kind of preface our discussion with that. Any questions on why, how, and where we're at in the process of evaluating this housing needs assessment? Very good, thank you.
That's
I'd like to invite our guests tonight then, Dr. Christian Karen, I think you're gonna start us off. You wanna come on up to the podium? Thank you.
All right. So good evening, all. It's a pleasure to be back up here in Wellington. I wish that I had brought the warmer, I mean, I guess I brought the colder weather up here with me. It was nice this afternoon. Now it's not so nice, but here we are. Yeah, so we are really in the final stages of the HNA, as Cody sort of mentioned. We've concluded our analysis of the data, which we presented last time. This presentation is going to be more so focused on the strategies that you all can use to sort of move the needle. Can you go back one slide? Actually, I wanted to get a chance to introduce Mike. Yeah. So you all know me. I was here a couple months back. I am the senior research analyst with Matrix Design Group, and the project manager for this project. I've been with Matrix for going on 3 years now, and I'm joined by my colleague, Mike James. He is our director of planning. He has, I believe, 25 to 30 years of experience with community planning, lots of experience with transportation-oriented development and housing, worked in prominent roles and for communities such as the city of Seattle. And he flew up here from Phoenix to be here for this presentation tonight. You can go on. All right, so a little bit about the agenda for this evening. I want to start with a recap of the main findings from the housing needs assessment. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the community engagement portion of the project. And finally, we're going to conclude with a more in-depth discussion of some of the recommendations that we believe can help to move the needle. All right, so to recap from last time, and recall that the main data source that we used for this project was the 2022 5-year version of the American Community Survey, which covered the period from 2018 to 2022. So obviously it's, you know, not completely current, right? But it's the highest quality data that is available. And in terms of demographics and socioeconomics, it's really the only data source for these types of metrics. So in terms of household income for Wellington, the median household earned just over $101,000 during that 5-year window. Yet at the same time, the poverty rate was somewhat high at over 7%, which suggests the presence of substantial income inequality, right? The home ownership rate was 84%, which was virtually unchanged from the prior 5-year period. And this is a reflection, we think, of the composition of the housing stock, right? When your housing stock is primarily single-family detached homes, right, most people are gonna own them, right? The median year of construction was 2007 as of the most recent data, which means that the housing stock is relatively new, right? Now, in terms of the indicators of housing insecurity, what we found is that about 2% of households qualify as overcrowded. What does that mean? That means there's more than one person in that household per room. And that's actually a favorable rate compared to a lot of communities that we've looked at. But at the same time, 41% of renters are cost burdened, which means that they spend more than 30% of their incomes on housing. So we find that renters are challenged. 23% of homeowners with mortgages spend over 30% of their income on total monthly costs. So that includes things like homeowners insurance and property taxes, as well as utilities. So homeowners, not surprisingly, fare much better than renters. We found in an analysis of more current market data, these numbers, I believe, are from a data poll that we conducted of the rental market in last August, that median income, and by the way, this isn't, sorry, not median income, median rent, and this doesn't include costs such as utilities, right? This is just median base rent, was close to $2,400. And when you factor in the average utility costs in Wellington, what that means is a household or a family needs to earn close to $114,000 to afford to live in a unit like that. In terms of median sale price, from the time period that we used for the analysis, what we found is that the median home sold for around $480,000. HUD says that in order to afford a home, right, its sales price should ideally not be more than 3 times your household's income. So that means to afford a home at $480,000, a family needs to earn, close to $160,000. Next slide. Okay, so what these tables present is the gap between households and housing units by income tier. So we were responsive to some of the feedback we got last time, which was, and the way that we addressed it was, what you see at each tier, that reflects the cumulative number of households in housing units, not the number at a specific tier. And when you conduct the analysis in this way, what you'll find is, the deficits, right, are at the lower end of the income tiers, which isn't too surprising, right? So, for example, at the below 50% AMI rental level, as per the most recent version of the ACS, there were no rental units that were affordable at that price point. Yet there were close to 140 households at that price point. I mean, that needed homes that were affordable at that level. So that means that there's a shortage of like close to 140 units. What you see on the right is an analysis of for sale housing. And the way that we conducted this analysis was the way to think about it is housing units were sorted into income tiers based on their current market values, right? So it's basically giving you an idea of, hey, how well would Wellington homeowners be able to afford their homes if they were purchasing them today, right, under the current market? And what you see again is really a significant shortage at the below 120% of AMI level. So most people who are currently living in Wellington, right, they would not be able to afford those homes if they were to purchase them today. Next slide. All right, now we want to talk a little bit about the community engagement piece of the project.
So Christian, if I could recommend that there's a lot of data in the report, and before we move on to the community engagement and what we're hearing from residents and stakeholders, are there any questions about the data and the numbers that Mr. Karen has presented so far? Any thoughts on what those numbers mean?
They get over the shock first.
You want to talk about that? Because the next segment kind of gets into the stakeholder and community engagement feedback that we've collected. And so I wanted to just have this pause if there was any discussion around the data-driven numbers so far.
That was not a work session presentation at all, was it? It's been a couple months. I don't remember.
So, it's all the same data, but the difference is, for example, like that, below 50% AMI category, last time that was 30 to 50% of AMI, you know, and the first tier was 0 to 30% AMI. It's the same data, it's just presented a little bit differently.
Yeah, and what you're seeing in the slideshow is kind of summarized out of some of the data that's in the report, but yeah, the data hasn't significantly
Right.
changed the way staff has asked some questions. We took feedback from the planning commission and asked Christian and others to reevaluate how it was being presented to make it tell the story a little bit better.
Biggest issue I see is, honestly, it's for the builders to try to figure out how they can actually build a product that can actually be rented affordably or sell affordably, because the way the market is right now with materials and all the different fees, it's hard for a builder to actually get to that point where somebody can either purchase it as a rental unit or it's built specifically as a rental unit to make it affordable. That's probably the biggest issue that I see with all of this is the how do you get there? Because it's super expensive right now to build.
Some of the how is what we're going to get to in a few minutes, or some ideas on how to get to how. But I mean, well said, and definitely something we want to tackle.
I think just putting the verbal context to looking at those gaps in terms of if you were to wipe the slate clean and refill Wellington's population, this is how many people couldn't afford to move back into their own house. Like that data doesn't get presented very often, if ever. Not with the context to go with it. It's scary. It's a little scary. I mean, it's not obviously going to just happen overnight that way, but what does that speak to in terms of, when the economy gets going again and people aren't stuck in their homes and interest rates drop and you start contemplating moving if you need to or have to, people coming into this community, this is what they're faced with. It's not necessarily those of us sitting in the room right now, but that's what's coming for anyone that wants to move into this town.
And the younger generation coming up that are either getting out of school, graduating, or, getting married, there's not a lot of great options for really those first-time home owners, renters.
There's no options.
There's, yeah. More need.
Overcrowded housing.
I think
Only
there's,
option.
I'm sorry.
That's the only option.
Oh, yes. I think it's also, relevant to tie back to some of the context in the text of the report that, a lot of Wellington residents, or maybe this is in the community engagement piece we're gonna touch on here in a minute too, but a lot of Wellington residents, once they're in their homes, they stay in their homes for a long time. So units that might otherwise be affordable just don't become available very frequently. And so the opportunities are few and far between.
Like you said, we can't afford to move into our own houses.
It's a little bit of slap in the face, isn't it?
Okay. Any other discussion on these points before we move on? The next section is pretty interesting too, so.
All right, so now we're gonna talk a little bit about the community engagement campaign that we've been conducting over the past several months. So this week, we are wrapping up our interviews with key stakeholders. We have engaged a diverse group of folks working in the real estate space, the nonprofit world. We've also made sure to engage builders and developers. So we're really getting a diverse array of perspectives to help inform the report. We also had a series of pop-up events back in the fall. I believe those results were on display at the first planning commission meeting, where folks basically were giving an opportunity to vote on the types of housing that they would like to see in Wellington. What we didn't have last time, because it was still under administration, was the resident survey. So I'd like to share some of the key findings from that with you today. So the first question, why do you choose to live in Wellington? Really what it came down to, well, people gave a diversity of reasons, right? But the most popular ones, and it's hard to see from here, is the small town culture and aesthetic. That probably doesn't come as a surprise to you all, right? People want to get away from, Denver or Fort Collins, right? And second, the affordability of housing. Now, what's interesting to note about that is, okay, we know based on current market data that housing in Wellington really isn't that affordable, right? But people may be thinking of this in relative terms, right? So compared to maybe Fort Collins or Boulder, yeah, Wellington is affordable. Also, it's important to keep in mind most of the folks who live in Wellington and who therefore took the survey are homeowners, right? Who've been in their homes, for a while. So it's not too surprising that they say that that's a draw of Wellington. Folks also pointed to the low crime rate and the fact that Wellington gives them the opportunity to live near family and friends. Next chart. So this chart, so residents were asked, how long have you lived in your current housing, right? And second, how difficult was it for you to locate housing in Wellington? In this chart, what it does is it combines the results from those two questions, right? And what you can see is that for people who've lived in their housing for less than 1 year or for 1 to 3 years, right? They're much more likely to say, hey, it was difficult or very difficult to find housing in Wellington. Whereas You know, when you ask people who've lived in their homes for an extended period of time, like 7 to 10 years or more than 10 years, they're more likely to say it wasn't difficult at all or it was only somewhat difficult to find housing. So this just reinforces the finding that, yeah, market conditions over the past few years have been very unfavorable to, buyers. Next slide. All right, now, there's a lot going on here. So what I'll start by saying is that residents were asked, how confident are you? And these results are presented in the top left. How confident are you that you'll be able to meet your upcoming housing payment? Most people say that they're confident, right? They don't think that there will be an be be a problem in meeting that payment. And I can't see this next one.
Housing costs, have they significantly hindered?
Got
our
it.
ability to do the
All right.
following?
Yeah. Okay, so the point that I wanted to make is even though Wellington residents, for the most part, are pretty confident that they can meet their housing costs, that doesn't mean that housing costs don't impose a major burden on them, right? So, a large percentage of residents say that because of high housing costs, they're unable to save for emergencies, right? To save for retirement, or to pay off non-housing debt like student loans or credit cards, to pay for medical care, right? To pay for these other essential, basic expenses, right? Um, and on the two bottom pie charts, they were asked, sorry.
It's a major source of stress.
All right, yeah. So a significant percentage say that housing costs, you know, thanks, cause major stress in their lives. And I think the results from this question are probably the most concerning of all, right? Where folks were asked within the past year, have you limited your consumption of food, medicine, or other essential goods to cover housing costs? 40% of residents said yes, right? So 4 in 10.
I just want to jump in real quick, actually, just on this on the left. I think it's, easy to say, okay, right, the majority of people are not concerned about that. But we are still looking right at between not so confident and not at all confident. That's still 17% of people, right, who don't know if they're gonna be able to make their payment. And that's right, that's the bare minimum. That's not the other stuff Christian was talking about, but that's literally just, and right, if we bring that out, that's thousands of people still. So
Right. Yeah. That's a great point.
Most pressing housing issues is the left chart.
Christian, let me know if you want me to zoom in on anything.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna need you to zoom in. All right, so residents were asked to identify the most pressing housing issues in Wellington. Not surprisingly, the rising cost of utilities, right, was the most common response. Which is not surprising at all, given about what we've heard about water, for example. Second, younger people cannot afford to buy homes, right? We talked a lot last time about latent households, right? Which one example of that is you have kids who are maybe in their 20s or 30s who can't afford to buy a home, right? So they're still living with their parents, right? So that challenge is reflected there. Next, people also cited the unaffordability of rent. And we also saw that a high percentage of people pointed out that there's inadequate housing for seniors. And this is something that we really made an effort to address in our recommendations. Um, so on the right, what you see are the results from a question, hey, if a development plan provides affordable housing, should the town help make the project more financially feasible by offering incentives or reduced fees for the development? And what we see there is, you had a handful of people, right, who didn't really have an opinion. They said neither agree nor disagree. But more folks indicated that they disagreed or strongly disagreed than that they strongly agreed or agreed. And what I will say is, for a question like this, we've asked this as parts of surveys for other communities. The results are really they're sensitive to the question wording a lot, right? It's possible that some people read this as, hey, this is just a giveaway to developers. Whereas if we had maybe whereas if we had worded it maybe slightly differently, the outcome would have been much different. Next slide. All right. And with that, I will hand it over to Mike James.
While Mike is coming up, any questions or discussion on the highlights from the community engagement resident surveys or from the details in the report?
Town's gotta do, town's gotta do a better job communicating that the water issues are, water supply is available. Certainly the rates is a very different discussion, but it seems that there's quite a bit of lag between people's understanding of what might have been going on behind the scenes. So,
I think that's a fair point. I would also point out that during the period when this survey was open, and I think the majority of the comments came in fairly early when the survey was out, which was early fall. A lot of homeowners were probably still paying for irrigation bills. And it probably may have had I don't want to assume too much, but it could have had an undue influence on that survey that if we put it out today, it might have tempered that a little bit. But, the numbers are the numbers. We recognize that there are rising costs associated with electric, gas, water, and other utilities. But probably the timing of this survey was top of mind for a lot of residents for sure.
All right. Well, it's great to be here, as Christian mentioned earlier. Just wanted to start a little bit on the housing strategies and talking about some of the general considerations. You can go to the next slide there. So one of the things I think is really important to understand, and Cody said it at the beginning, is, we've identified a series of solutions here. Not all of these are going to be laser focused directly applicable for where Wellington is right now in the life of your city and where you are in the development scale. So, one of the things that's great about working with Christian, does an amazing job with, identifying all the different data, analysis, the needs, the stock, the housing, the population, demographics, all of that. And then when, Cody and the planning side and the economic development folks here in the city look at that and they have to, figure out how does that relate to what we have in our comprehensive plan, in our land use development codes, in our policy recommendations, and some of our regulatory frameworks as well. And so you'll see a wide range of recommendations that we're going to talk about. And I'll try to focus in on some of the key things I think really will benefit Wellington in this situation. So just some of the general considerations is, there's some limited availability of developable land. So there's a lot of land that's been entitled for single family residential. And then other land that's not is really identified for more of an economic purpose for, your activity centers, for jobs, employment, retail, commercial. So that's, an important part of your community too, that all this has to be balanced. So we want to think about that. As a, suburban community with 90% single family, detached homes, that's not a bad thing. That's just where you are. There's not a lot of other diversity in other housing types because, we're in a market society and that's really what the demand is. And, it's produced some great communities, some great neighborhoods and some good housing for you guys and a nice, good place to live. So nothing wrong with that. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, some of the economic considerations are important too, because for, that Main Street commercial concept or, attracting additional employment jobs along your freeway lands, it's going to need workers, right? It's going to need that workforce housing. So how can that come into the city? So we're going to look at some options for that. And then, really kind of looking at what can we do with what's out there today, whether it's older stock, whether it's the existing stock, how can we, enhance that for more opportunities for living? One of the things I would, in looking at Wellington, we're in a community where you don't have a lot of diversity of housing types. A lot of communities like yours will start with senior housing solutions and looking at that first, because certainly with the data shows that there's a need, right? The other thing is just that senior community, they don't want to leave, right? Their social networks are here, their friends are here. It's their life. They don't want to lose their life. So typically that's a good place to start for communities like yours. So just wanted to kind of throw that out. The other thing that I would say as far as general considerations are a lot of these strategies that we're talking about enable partnerships. And so it's those partnerships that are going to work in Wellington that are going to be important for you. So, whether that's a nonprofit that wants to come in and do something for senior housing, or whether you've got a workforce housing developer, that needs to look at a rezoning, but he's got a great opportunity for workforce housing. This is really the start of a partnership. This data, this information really puts you on a path for those opportunities. So we'll we can go to the next slide and talk about one of the first thing that we have as a strategy is looking at accessible dwelling units. So really accessible dwelling units are additional units on particularly like a single family lot. They've often been called casitas, mother-in-law flats. There's a lot of different names for them, and they are allowed today. But there hasn't been a lot of that. One of the reasons why these can be really good is they do support that multi-generational housing. They're good for seniors, or young professionals within your family or others that really can have an affordable place to live. So, it also provides an opportunity for age in place for parents. Maybe their kids take over the main house. They could have an accessible dwelling unit in their backyard, and they could kind of have that connection and stay in their place. So we looked at some strategies that we could employ here. So one is just basically increasing the size of accessible dwelling units could be helpful. They're in their current land use code. There's some restrictions, so we could look at maybe expanding that opportunity. Could also look at some of the design requirements. Certainly, this is a preference. Your code has, you really maintain the architectural style. I think that's important for attached units because you don't want kind of a house that has something attached to it that isn't cohesive with the initial style and the rest of your neighbors. You don't want to start those kind of issues. But it might be a good idea to look at some flexibility on detached units that maybe are in the back that are not seen from the street. That maybe those don't need to have that same strict requirements. As you mentioned earlier, I'm looking at reassess some of the utility connection or impact fees. That can also be helpful and for when you're looking at housing development. I don't live here in Colorado, but I have heard that some of the utilities costs and getting those utilities is quite high here. So I don't know all the details of that, but that's something that the town can look at. Another thing is, reconsider some of the owner occupancy requirements. This really kind of refers to some of the problems you may have heard in other communities with short-term rentals, where short-term rentals come in, they can, like a house could turn into a party house, right? Or be a nuisance to their neighbors. So some kind of way to, ensure that those are managed and understood in the community can be helpful. The last thing is an opportunity to look at pre-approved ADUs. Potentially, design standards are designs that are already pre-approved by the town and the building department. So when people come in, there's a reduced cost for reviews and fees because they know it's already up to code. So, that's another part of that, is really kind of that streamlining the permit and the construction. So, anything that can basically help get more housing stock is really kind of the objective. Okay, you want to go to the next slide? Okay, so really incentives for affordable development. These strategies and this slide really refers to primarily multifamily development, not so much single family, but more of a multifamily kind of situation. So why should we look at this? So, affordable development, you're not going to have the same profit margin for those types of developments. So anything that can lower those initial costs can help make something happen, particularly if there's a good in the community for providing workforce housing or senior housing or housing for young professionals or service workers, etc. So, the one bullet that's kind of striking there, that last bullet on the Y, the median asking rent of $23.95. That's a lot. That's a lot. That's a lot for rent, right? So how can we help that out? So some of the strategies that we look at are, anything that can reduce the development costs. So one concept is looking at parking standards. I know parking, like housing and religion, can be very personal. But I've seen some great models where multifamily developers, they'll just manage their parking. So for example, if the parking is reduced to say 1.5 units for a 2-bedroom, for example, if someone comes in and it's a single parent and a child in a 2-bedroom unit, they're not going to need 2 spaces of cars, right? For 2 parking spaces. So they'll have 1. The next unit might need 2. It might be 2 working professionals sharing, roommates. So by managing the demand, they can reduce the overall demand. And that's really the point of how do you have 1.5 units, or 1.5 parking spaces for 2 units. So it's really managing that parking so that you can reduce the overall number of parking spaces and cost. So just a little example. We've identified some ways to introduce flexibility in the design review process. There's ways to streamlining that. That's being encouraged here in Colorado. Another option is adopting inclusionary zoning, but I would say you have to be very careful about that. Inclusionary zoning is basically requires that when a developer comes in that a certain units be affordable. And I would say you want to be careful because you don't want to discourage any development, right? That could discourage anyone from coming in because they're not prepared to do that. So typically, if you're looking at inclusionary zoning, you'd also want to have some benefits or some things that are going to help that development with either additional units or other infrastructure contributions from the town to offset that inclusionary zoning. But that's probably not something that that's probably later in your evolutionary stage of development as a town. But it is a tool we wanted to bring forward. And as I mentioned earlier, anytime you're expediting review timeframes, are waiving permit fees, that will help the overall development of an affordable project. Okay, next slide. So this one is, housing rehabilitation, preservation, and infill development. It's kind of like conserving water. It doesn't seem too exciting, but there's a great benefit to a community if you can maintain the existing housing stock that you have. And so really, this is just taking advantage of the different funding opportunities they are to develop programs to maintain the affordable housing stock that's out there today, and really allow people to age in place, stay in their homes, and make those homes being a valued part of the overall community. So one of the things that that all communities have are naturally occurring affordable housing. So those are, a lot of times those are homes where people have been there in a long time, or maybe they've handed them off to the next generation. And they're affordable because either the mortgage is paid or it's low. Maybe it's a shared housing condition. So one of the things that cities can do is understand where those places are and identify programs from that. You've actually done that in your comprehensive plan with your downtown area. You've kind of identified some of those older areas for housing that could benefit from preservation, rehabilitation, in some cases infill, in some cases, older housing shouldn't be maintained. Maybe it's probably more efficient to remove it. So you guys have kind of already done that in your comprehensive plan. Again, looking to your policy guidance, whether it's your comprehensive plan or other specific area plans, look for where you've identified opportunities for housing. And you do have some activity centers, it's not on this map, in your comprehensive plan, where you've looked at, hey, we should look at some opportunities. So working with your development community as projects come in, that's a great tool that you have. Okay, the next one is really more on the development side. So anytime when you're looking at your land use and development codes, you can get more units to the acre, you're going to get more housing, right? It's going to be a higher density, so there's other considerations to have. You want to make sure that you're maintaining good setbacks for safety and for health and emergency fire access and all those things. But is there a way within your existing land, your development codes, land use development codes, to provide some flexibility? So certain housing standards or housing designs could work on different size units. So, we've identified in the report in much more detail opportunities to look at some of the lot dimensions in your R2 and R3, potentially increasing the net density in some of your higher density residential areas on the land use map. And understand that all this goes back to that opportunities with employment. So you need people to have a place to live so that they can work nearby and support the economic development. So you really want to have a balance of that land uses that is prescribed in your comprehensive plan. The other thing that we identified, it's not on this slide, is really the opportunity for cluster development. If there are future annexations or some reconsideration of some of your land uses, can you have maybe smaller or more dense units and then preserve some of that other land for employment type uses? So we're more of kind of a mixed use opportunity. So there's a lot, I know that Cody and his team will be looking at, as this progresses in the future and you're looking at options, there's a lot there to delve into. This next one really is like diversifying the housing stock, you know, really promoting that multifamily opportunities in your R4, opportunities for single or senior housing is going to be important. I'm looking at the data that Christian developed. You know, one of the things we identified is potentially um, expand or adapt your mixed use category to permit residential uses by right rather than being conditional. Um, that's, you know, you at the same time, you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to just have all residential and no employment and commercial uses as well. So that's an important balance. Um, one of the things it says here is support gentle density. So, you know, a lot of times you don't need to have a 10-story building to have density. You can have good density with, 2, 3, 4 stories without getting crazy and making sure that's appropriate to the scale of your community. The last one I think I mentioned is a little bit earlier too is there an opportunity to permit smaller lots? I know that looking across the country, there's a lot of new, I'll call them starter home options where there's a house 15 feet wide by 80 feet long, 3 bedrooms, has an upstairs, very attractive, you know, single car garage, loaded off the alley, great starter home option. That doesn't need a 50-foot wide lot. It can be done on a 30-foot wide lot. So looking at some of those options out there can be eye-opening as well. Okay, so next we go to senior housing. I kind of gave you a spoiler on this. I'm a big fan of really communities like yours, starting with senior housing, finding those agencies, those partnerships that want to be in your community, that want to provide that opportunity for people who already live here in particular. Supports aging in place. And really can also go hand in hand with those accessible dwelling units. And keeping families supportive of each other. Again, supports independent assisted living. There's opportunity for memory care facilities as well. There's a lot of development out there, as you guys know, in that realm. There's also other programs within, the county where you can get resources, provide services, and then look to be eligible for additional grants in the future. So we've identified a lot of those in the full report. So the next slide really, and I really don't want to go into all the details of this because we've detailed it all in the report, but I'll hit on a couple of high points that I think are applicable to you. Obviously, community development block grants are something that, are used, for housing improvements. And that really can support that preservation of maybe older homes, but good stock that you want to retain in the community. I'll talk a little bit about the self-help ownership program. This is really one of those partnership opportunities where it's really targeted to nonprofits. But what that can help do is identify land for acquisitions. So one of the neat models is community land trust. A community land trust will basically acquire land for affordable housing, and then they'll work with the developer. A developer will build the units, but because they don't have to purchase the land, those units can be rented at a lower cost. So that's a great model, a partnership model to think about as well. Again, the Home Investment Partnership Program is really for those low-income folks, low-income housing opportunities. And then the Section 811, that's a typo, it should be Section 811. That's really targeted toward low-income folks with disabilities. So just some other programs that are out there. At the state level, um, as you know, the last several years, Colorado has really been proactive in trying to face and address housing needs, housing affordability, and like this grant supporting local communities and really developing a plan for the future. So they have a funding program for local government, the Housing Development Grant and Loan Fund. This is really to look at infill and adaptive reuse. I don't know, I'm not all that familiar with the how many opportunities you might have for that, but certainly infill, there's an opportunity to look at that program. Another program that other communities, including small communities here in Colorado, are doing is Proposition 123. This really commits the town to increasing the affordable housing by 3% for 3 consecutive years. Certainly, that would take some planning, some financial planning by the city, and some scheduling out what that might look like and where it could happen. But that's a great opportunity as well. And then the other thing is based on potential partners, potential funding strategies, what your elected officials, the focus that they want to go, you really can create supportive housing programs for specific targeted groups. I talk a lot about senior housing because I think that's a great place to start, but there are also workforce development housing developers where they'll have a specific demographic area that they're looking to work in. They have a specific product that they develop, typically 5 to 7 stories. It's got a certain look. It's a certain architecture because they don't want to they want to keep their costs lows. But there's some really great examples of some workforce developers. And so, again, that's a partnership and trying to attract the non-traditional developers, right? They're a small group because what they do is very difficult compared to coming and doing a typical greenfield subdivision. But they're out there. So that's just a little bit of flavor. There's a lot of recommendations. I think that we've put together a lot for the town and you guys to take a look at and think about. But I wanted to kind of give you a high level overview of there's a lot of tools in the toolbox as Cody mentioned earlier. So certainly that's going to take some additional refinement by the town and with you and your elected officials and the community to find that fit and those right partnerships. But that's really a lot of what DOLA and this grant and this effort is to do, is to identify those needs and then the opportunities. So it's really been interesting and fun looking specifically at your community. So I appreciate that.
Questions for the strategies that Mike has presented so far this evening?
Yeah, I was just curious, I mean, my name's Tim Whitehouse.
Yeah.
Several of these programs are all federal HUD.
Oh, thank you.
With the chaos that's going on in Washington, what is your read on the availability of any of these things currently moving forward? Because there's all sorts of weird things coming out. So
Yeah.
do you have any sense working in this area? Like you're probably scratching your head just like everyone else going.
Well, like right now is we're all kind of like wait, watch, and see. I mean, that's one of the things I did search this morning. Have there been any executive orders that have related to affordable housing? There hasn't, but as you know, the grant situation is a little in flux right now. So there's a couple. Well, I think we're all just watching very carefully.
I don't think anybody knows.
Yeah, I don't think anybody does know. I do think some of the some of the programs that are related to specifically American with Disabilities Act, that's a civil right. I don't think those are going to be a problematic. But some of the other ones we are watching and worrying a little bit. about some of the grant funds.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they're just frozen right now and determining. The other thing is places like DOLA, right? I mean, how much funding where are the funding sources from that? Is that coming from the federal government primarily, or is it a combination of federal and state?
No,
Just
they
trying to see like what opportunities are up there.
so they have they have I want to get this right, 0.1% sales tax that's funding the Proposition 123, which is the main fund for the affordable housing. So that's 0.1% statewide sales tax that's funding that piece. So, and I know we have the millions of dollars that it's created in the recent time period, but I don't have it committed to memory. It's in the report, but it's several $1 million that they're raising for that affordable housing projects.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like 360 million or something annually. Yeah, so it's quite a bit. So that's really where the funding for that Proposition 123 is coming from.
I had a question, who's recommending lowering requirements for ADUs. What are our requirements for ADUs in Wellington?
Yeah, so, and I have had quite a few inquiries regarding the possibility of adding ADUs on lots, mostly in the old portion of town in the R4 zone. We're seeing some patterns in those inquiries, and I can attest that none of them have proceeded for different reasons. First of all, we have had a few inquiries from outside the R4 zone, and most of those have private covenants in place that don't allow ADUs, which is, as you look at the zoning map, is most of the community.
When you say a private covenant, you mean an HOA?
HOA.
Can an
yep,
HOA actually stop an ADU though?
Yes.
can currently.
They can currently.
Other states have preempted that ability, and that could potentially be on the horizon for Colorado, where the state legislature preempts the ability for HOAs to restrict that. They've done it in other things like landscape or non-living turf, xeric gardens and requirements. They've preempted some abilities from HOAs to say, no, you can't do that anymore. And this, I don't know if, I'm not trying to forecast anything, but other states have already done that. So it's a possibility.
Is there anything in place that states new developments can't do ADUs for units? I'll use our Bloom project with our cottages. 16-foot or 20-foot single family homes, detached garages with ADUs above. So it's basically a 4-stack of garages with 2 ADUs over it. So that's built into the whole plan. So is there anything that states right now in town that a new development like that wouldn't be allowed?
Perhaps, and those are the things we would want to take a look at, that we do feel that some of the requirements are overly restrictive. There's some building codes and things that always play a factor for separation on units and some other things in habitable spaces that we have to be cognizant of. But from a land use standpoint, what we're seeing is that the biggest hindrances are meeting some of the setback and lot size stipulations that we have on the books currently. We do have I think it's 1,000 square foot max for ADUs, which may not be the right size for that. Some other questions we've run into are just the setbacks. I want to add a unit in the back, but I've got a small lot and I can't make it fit when I have to meet 10 foot here and 5 foot there and 10 feet over here. So we want to reevaluate that and look at what those alternatives are. What we do allow is ADUs can be detached or attached, but the attached component may not make sense right now from a cost effectiveness standpoint, because you're modifying an existing structure in pretty significant ways to add on, whereas a standalone detached might be a little bit cheaper option and not have the same impacts to an occupied unit. The owner occupancy requirement is one that we currently have on the books, that if you have the principal structure, so the existing home, you have to live there if you're going to have a second ADU. And what that was kind of originally put in place to create was some surety of, we know who our neighbors are and who's going in and out every day. If the primary structure is a rental, They can't currently have a second unit on that
Makes
lot.
sense.
And it could be overly restrictive though, because if it's a rental unit and there's another rental unit, there's still two residential homes. Why does that restriction come into play?
But in that case, let's just take, for example, Pheasant Run, since we have an HOA. Even if we allowed an ADU to come in and then that person rented it, now you have two different sets of homeowners driving on a road that's a private road that has, so they're gonna have to charge maintenance fees somehow to pay for the extra traffic to fix the roads. But that's just stating one thing. What about right now, if you had somebody who had the lot big enough to put an ADU in, do they have to have separate utilities and water all that, or can they tap into their own?
So that's a great segue. So, and it's a little bit unclear right now. And this is something that I've talked with our utility folks, and they've kind of made that commitment to, yeah, we need to evaluate this in a more, logical way to evaluate what the true impacts are. Our current language in the code requires that utilities have to be tied through the original unit.
Yeah.
But then it gets into challenges like gravity sewer. Do you have enough depth to still flow that side? Are you putting in lift pumps?
Sure.
It creates a question of, if you're adding an additional unit, what's the impact? Or they just get water and sewer without charging an impact fee for it? And if you take that too far to the other extreme, if you charge a full impact fee on an accessory unit, well, the water demand on an accessory dwelling unit at 800 or 1,000 square feet is far less than what a principal structure would be generating. So the full impact fee is not an appropriate fit either. And so the solution in reality probably lies somewhere in the middle. And that's what we need to evaluate, is right sizing impact fees for an accessory dwelling unit. It's probably not zero, and it's probably not the full impact. Evaluating on a square foot basis or a per bedroom basis would make a lot more sense, is what we're seeing from a kind of a case study standpoint for right sizing impact fees for those units.
So I guess I can see with all the HOAs in town why you haven't been just drastically going after the ADU stuff, because there's majority of them aren't gonna allow them anyway.
Right, and that's, again, I think that is something that is likely going to evolve over time. And we knew that when we allowed it in the land use code, that accessory dwelling units, they're currently allowed as a use by right in all residential zone districts, I think, except for the manufactured home parks. They're kind of already in that same position where ADUs don't make a lot of sense. You've already got the density there. But all of our other residential categories allow ADUs as a use by right. And we knew that most of them would be restricted by private covenants or HOAs. But we took the step to enable those to happen. If an HOA chooses to change their covenants and say, we've had enough homeowners that voted that they want to allow this, why would the town stand in the way of stopping it with different regulations? So I think that will happen slowly. But we wanted to make sure that from a town standpoint, we weren't overly restricting that use just because the private covenants currently are.
But it's somewhat difficult to change the HOA covenants, right? There's a vote by the members and it has to hit a certain threshold, correct?
Yeah, yes, but the thresholds might vary a little bit from community to community or neighborhood to neighborhood. It depends on how they were constructed and what time period they were put in place in. Those procedures or practices have changed a little bit over the years too.
It'd be a little easier for my HOA. There's
Mhm.
only 16 homes.
Yeah, but I mean, I thought the next step does it not have to go to the Board of Trustees for approval because there's a contract between the town and the development?
No.
Oh,
the-
okay.
So the town does not enforce private covenants. That's strictly up to the neighborhood associations to self-manage those. The town is not a part of that contract or that agreement.
Oh, I thought they were part of the approval of changing the language.
Not
Because
once the covenants are already established.
Okay.
Once they're established, then it's self-maintained.
Okay, thank
There-
you.
And there may be limited circumstances where something specific was put in place where that caveat was added. I don't want to speak wholesale for every single situation. There may be reasons why the town wanted to review a change to covenants if there was something specific for that neighborhood. But I think the other way of looking at it is, what interest does the town have in saying, no, you can't do that when we're already allowing it by right? And so even if there is a requirement to get approval, it might not take a lot of explaining. We already allow it, you're trying to allow it. looks great, go for it.
Mhm.
So there's that element in there too.
Mhm.
So next steps, as far as implementation plan, that's kind of the end of the report. So for next steps, I guess kind of building on what we're talking about, it sounds like it makes more sense to keep our next steps very hyper local to building codes, the comp plan, things that we can self-manage and control the ability in this room, as opposed to getting too deep into the federal funding and state funding and all that, considering it may be different next time we meet yet again.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So you know me, I'm trying to plan ahead to the next meeting and next time this comes up, what is the goal for the next?
Well, that actually is a question I had. Well, at what point, obviously, this board does not create policy. We make recommendations to the Board of Trustees and they debate it and set the priorities and policies. At what point are they involved to say, this is a priority of our group, that we're tasking the planning commission to kind of go down this path?
It
So
is
where
a
does that-
policy of the town and it is a priority of the board. The comprehensive plan is an official adopted policy of the town
Okay.
that has strategies for affordability and diversity and housing types. And the board's strategic plan that was just adopted in April or May, forget the exact month. Their strategic plan identified housing diversity as one of their strategic priorities, as well as incentives for development for achieving residential uses.
Okay,
So these are already priorities of the board in written adopted policies.
okay, thank you.
So the direction is to pursue this, and I guess another layer is the board approved the contract to undertake this study and implement its recommendations. So maybe more along the lines of the process for how to do that, which kind of dovetails the two prior comments there. What the housing needs assessment and strategy recommendations that Matrix is, and Mike, I apologize, you can probably sit down.
Oh, okay.
That's fine.
What this report is identifying are potential strategies to pursue. What staff is working with Matrix on, we're still collecting some feedback here from the planning commission, from stakeholders. We're presenting to the board of trustees next week. So there's still some pieces that we're trying to further evaluate. But the implementation table that's near the end of the report identifies some short-term, mid-term, and long-term strategy development. As we mentioned, it's not a one and done. But what staff is recommending is that we're going to take some of those short-term strategies, and these are the land use code, lot sizes, ADU language, and current restrictions maybe being lessened, parking requirements maybe being lessened for qualifying projects. Those are pretty simple things to write up, that if there's a kind of a general nod from the planning commission, we're going to seek a nod from the board of trustees, like, are these strategies moving us in the right direction to help close the gap on these housing needs? And staff feels that they are. If we get the nod, then staff is going to bring back, these are the couple of strategies that we can implement fairly easily without a lot of cost. I mean, we're talking about some staff time to write up ordinance changes that change some text of the code to clarify on these issues and create some more flexibility. We plan on presenting that at the March Planning Commission meeting. And then again, to the Board of Trustees in March for hopeful adoption of some of those low-hanging fruit type of items that are just text changes to the code. We envision that there'll be other policy formation around incentives. Policy is something that doesn't happen overnight. That one's going to take a little bit more thought, some crunching of numbers to see which fees can be right-sized to make sure that we're not charging more than we need to for qualifying projects. If there's a waiver of development fees or development review fees, how much and what's the threshold for when we would consider doing those? We don't feel like it's across the board for everything, but we think that there is a threshold where qualifying projects or projects that implement certain key elements would be eligible for reductions or waivers in some instances. All of those take time to kind of vet what will be the impact to the town if we no longer collect those fees. And expedited timelines for review on qualifying projects is another one that staff thinks could be really impactful. Some of our zone districts require conditional approvals for residential, and as Mike had brought up, that's one of the biggest challenges for an affordable project is time. If it goes to 3 public hearings and at the end of the day, they've spent thousands and thousands of dollars on soft cost design and to make the proposal and then it doesn't get approved, that's a huge cost commitment for no product. And if they get approved, they've lost a year's worth of time in development review and public hearings. So right sizing the process to the projects makes a lot of sense too, that if the project meets defined goals and it's a use by right, then staff would have an automatic go ahead to, we're gonna expedite that review and get it done in 60 days instead of 120 days. So there's goals there that we've already identified that we think are possible to help developers and builders know what, or have a more predictable outcome. Right now, it's a little bit unpredictable or uncertain in terms of time frame and expectations, and we want to help clarify the expectations on the front end, and this is the time we think it's going to take to get through that so that they can start develop their relationships for, there's funding sources out there like low-income housing tax credits that take time to put together and have to have investors to do those. It's really hard to put those together and get the commitments when you don't know what the time frame is and you don't know if you're going to get approved. And so helping to consolidate some of those things are going to take time and engagement with our stakeholders that do those projects to know what is going to help make that an impactful and measurable benefit in the long run. So those aren't going to happen quickly, but we do want to continue to pursue them.
So in addition, for the low hanging fruit, as it's called, for March, could you also maybe have you guys take just a minute and kind of map out the steps above and beyond that? Things will take time, obviously. I think everybody understands that, but maybe tune and hone this a little bit more as to how much time, how is staff prioritizing the different things, what's going to come first, what's going to come second, and just an idea of how this is going to play out in the remainder of the year. I think that's something we'd be interested in seeing, like how much of this are we going to see in the next year, or after March, is it gone until another key piece moves that staff is going to be working on in the background?
Yeah, I think we can certainly work on putting some more meat on the bone for that. This is something that we're going to be talking with Matrix about, and we've kind of given an inkling what we think is, or what staff thinks is going to help illustrate the timelines, the resource commitments, which ones happen first, is a table maybe more akin to what we use in the comprehensive plan, where we have, short, medium, and long-term strategies. And then we've also identified, using, some nifty looking symbols, but, what's the order of magnitude for cost? Is it $1 sign for something that we can do in-house with local amendments? Is it $3 signs that is going to take outside resources and commitments to make those things happen, or infrastructure costs? We would like to kind of look at a similar metric to help identify, who are the responsible agencies that would help affect those strategies. If it's just planning efforts, if it's planning public works, if it's outside agency commitments that need to be leveraged to make those things happen. We haven't put that much detail into the strategies yet, because we were hoping to present these strategies to the Planning Commission and the board to make sure that we've got kind of a general support that these are going to be impactful. These are the right the groupings that we can consider, and then we'll start to flesh them out and bring them back in March. Would something like that be the useful component for aligning? Here's the target here, or here's the need that's identified. These are the strategies that can affect that need. Here's what it's going to take and how long it's going to take to get those things done.
Via the comp plan. Yeah, I think that format works well. It's an easy roadmap to follow.
Okay. We can certainly work on bringing that back in March, along with, I guess maybe one of the things I'm seeking from tonight's discussion, are there any of the strategies that we've presented that don't make any sense? Or they all proceed and see how we do on those? Are there any strategies that you've thought of that we haven't identified that would be meaningful to consider?
This is part related to information coming out of that Water Development Board. The town's ability to bond currently with both water and wastewater plants and their funding. Do you see, major bonding for this community is like pushed back to like what, 41 or something when?
Yeah, I think you're bringing up, Mr. Whitehouse is bringing up some topics from another strategy session that's been talked about in terms of water source development. And I think it's important to note that the bonding power of the town in those conversations is limited to the enterprise fund's ability to bond for the enterprise funded projects.
Okay, thank you for
The-
clarifying.
The town's broader bonding authority for like affordable housing might come out of general fund, which might have a different scenario. We haven't really evaluated
Okay,
those impacts for general fund or other funding sources. And there's different opportunities for, as some of the funding sources that Mike and Christian have presented, that might help leverage, additional funding sources to achieve a bigger project with a smaller commitment from the town. So we haven't got quite to that depth or level with these projects yet.
well, thanks for clarifying, as you pointed out, that those are enterprise funds, which are very different than, like the general fund. So, thank you.
Yeah, could be different pots of money, and we just haven't dug deep enough on these topics to know. We're just not quite at that stage yet.
I think that's where I'm at with your original question is I don't want to eliminate any of the proposals, any of the courses of action right now. Maybe as staff gets a little further down the road, some of them become viable, less viable, more viable, non-existent. But for right now, I think we're so shallow and high level, I wouldn't want to preclude you from spending any time eliminating one without knowing, with knowing such a small amount about it. I'd say keep it all on the table for right now. And then we'll see.
I appreciate that feedback. I will go a step further and say that, from a staff standpoint and working with Matrix on some of these recommendations, we do feel like some things that are kind of that low hanging fruit are in that table for the short term. Reducing the parking requirements is a pretty easy, low impact. Like you're not gonna see that a dramatic of a change in the community of the built environment when we reduce parking to something a little bit more measurable for an affordable housing project. Things like reducing lot sizes you're not going to see a huge dramatic impact overnight with those types of changes. And again, they're a relatively simple thing to adjust. It's just the text of the code. So those are things that we think would be back on the, with a little bit more, discussion and meat on it, but that would likely be at the March meeting where we think these are the strategies that we can adopt now, that'll start to move the needle in the right direction. We think lessening some of the current restrictions around ADUs will help with projects. I literally have names on a list that I would like to contact once we make some changes to say, hey, we've made these changes. Does this help you get closer to that project you asked me about a year ago? I think that there's some real potential there on the ADUs.
Does
And
the
the
ADU,
reduction-
go ahead.
In the reduction of lot sizes, would you also reduce setbacks requirements? Because town's current setbacks are 7 foot. Side yard.
7 feet for most of our zone districts. They are 4. We did reduce to 5 just based on existing and historic context. What we've started to run into, if we go down to 5 feet, we run into fire separation requirements on the eaves. And that's,
It's not as difficult to deal with, as you would think, but, even getting down to 3 foot setbacks would help, especially with like a cottage type product, where you're really trying to
yeah.
pack them in.
And I've
It's-
done some where we did 6 on one side and 0 on the other, and then you get into your openings requirements. And so I think that's a viable tool. I don't know that it would make as big of an impact in like overbuilding existing neighborhoods, but having an option
New
available.
developments.
And I think it's a great point. Stop me if anyone needs clarity on what that conversation looked like, but, planned unit development would be another way to do that for a specific project that's proposed for like patio homes or garden homes. And that's how I've handled it in communities in the past. Was our current code doesn't provide for that option, but a planned unit development state the reasons why, and we can modify those setbacks to meet that product need. It adds the uncertainty though of what's the time to get it approved and what's the certainty of the approval. But there are some tools in the toolbox. They might not be as efficient as we'd like them to be.
I'm gonna ask.
Okay, well, he's thinking.
Oh, what-
Now on Virgo's first.
And ADU, do they need to be on a permanent foundation, or can it be like a mini home It's on its own frame.
Yeah, so,
I don't.
yeah, like a movable structure or an RV is kind of a different animal in of itself because it doesn't fall under the building codes or the plumbing codes because it's movable. So we're focusing primarily on permanent structures. If it's mobile, it's not even under the building code, and so that's not something that we're targeting right now.
So right now where we are with Wellington and really Old Town, downtown core is really the only place that an ADU could be talked about because of most of the HOAs. Is that kind of,
Under the present context, it is, and I would say that under future subdivisions, there'd be an opportunity for staff to communicate with proposals on what's being considered, and is there an opportunity to, leave
Right.
that out of those restrictive covenants to, further prevent it? And when we say that the R4 is the only district that it's currently realistic for those, there's a lot of opportunity in the R4 for that. I mean, most of the lots are 120 feet to 132 feet in depth with 800 to 1,000 square foot homes on them. There's quite a bit of opportunity within the R4 zone to allow that gentle density. I think that it was described as in the presentation, that systematically allowing accessory dwelling units in the R4 is not going to have a dramatic impact on the character of that neighborhood, but you could slowly add that density in, which makes the new ADU an affordable unit, and it makes the primary structure on that lot more affordable because there's a supplemental revenue stream associated with it. And so it kind of has a compounding effect in terms of the benefits for affordable housing.
a lot of those have the alley access too, and, I'm listening about parking. It seems like that the board or what you bring back, a lot of that's going to focus initially on our downtown core. Or the R4.
I think some of the setback requirements for lot sizes will probably have a bigger impact there because there's not HOAs. The accessory dwelling unit opportunity exists more in the R4 than it will in the other districts that have HOAs. I think there's also, one of the strategies that was recommended, and it'll be a longer term strategy because of funding sources, but the naturally occurring affordable housing stock. I've done programs in the past in other communities where we were using CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant funding through HUD to specifically help older homes retrofit for energy efficiency upgrades, duct sealing, caulking, basic maintenance that preserved them and allowed them to be maintained as an affordable unit for longer. So those strategies are real, and I think would help in terms of existing homeowners too, that we can help you stay in your unit longer by keeping it viable than to let it, demolition by neglect because I can't afford to maintain it.
Well, and those are the ones that like low hanging fruit, 2 to 4 year or 0 to 2 year.
Yeah.
Is I think what I would think you'd want to look at sooner
Yeah.
or first.
Thank you. I think that is a good strategy. I will also point out one of the other kind of bigger impacts in terms of strategy recommendations that's not just limited to the old portion of town or the R4 district. Reducing the lot size and width requirements will have a positive benefit for new products in new subdivisions, especially looking at R3. It already has I think it's a 50-foot wide lot, which is less than the 70 that it used to be. But 50 feet, for some of the new products that are available now is not the right size for a starter home. And so by further reducing that width requirement and the lot size requirement would allow new developments to come in and be more competitive in the affordable housing market at that 100 AMI or 80 AMI, because it allows more density and it doesn't require the onerous yards that are underutilized by those tenants. So we think that there's a real impact there that will help entice builders to come back to Wellington for the ability to meet the market need that we're identifying. They just can't do it with a minimum 7,500 square foot lot and a 50-foot wide product.
Is there any communication that could be done to the HOAs? Say we are looking at some affordable housing. You know, and some of those I don't think they're that old, but I guess they are over 20+ years old, viewpoint. You know, if they have 1/2 acre lots, but their HOA is gonna prohibit a lot of this, could there be communication from the town going to those about why maybe this could be something they could look at their covenants and HOA and vote on? Also water usage. We have some wells that or some, the HOS have wells. The bigger ones don't. So there's a lot of water usage happening, like I said, in Viewpoint and even Wellington Point, I think.
It varies
I don't
by,
know.
it varies
I don't
by
know, it just-
subdivision on the water.
Yeah,
but
just some sort of communication with those HOAs to know what we're doing
yeah.
and
I-
what's,
We certainly can. We have good contacts with the HOA property managers to advise these are the things that we're looking at. I think as Bert or someone had mentioned,
and there's like only one.
it could be difficult to get a majority of residents in those HOAs to vote to make the change to the covenants.
Sure.
But they may not know it's an option if they don't know the information.
Yeah.
I think that does give back a little bit to some of the strategies for ADUs to, introduce and propose a pre-approved. Some parameters like, creates that certainty. If you do this, 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 and this, and it meets these, within these fences, you're going to get approval for it. That communication could go a long way to, why are we talking about this? They're not even possible. Well, they are possible, and here's how you do it. And here's your fees are fixed to square footage, so just, plug and play. All of a sudden, that becomes a lot more palatable to a resident that goes, I wasn't even considering it, but now that I know that it's easy and it's there for me, I'm gonna go solicit my board to see if they'll vote for that change to the covenants.
Yeah. Said I think it's scary to think that maybe couldn't qualify, many of us in Wellington, to get back into our own house.
And how many of us have aging parents that may need a place to stay?
Who's living? No.
I'm just
Not
gonna
about
drag a
us.
shed in
Who is
behind my house and hook up to my septic and Cody will never know it's there.
But you're the aging parent.
No.
You have to live.
Exactly, but I gotta live in that. That's okay.
I'm excited to hear about some options here. Yeah.
Yep.
Great.
Good direction. Good direction.
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Awesome.
very nice.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
There's no
Oh,
public.
There's no
several
public comment.
options. There's a public comment.
Is it short? Yes.
Oh, that was too long.
You're taking too long to walk to the podium, though.
Melissa's an easy target.
Page 74 is a loaded gun, the entire page. And we all know it. Because it could be interpreted that the entire burden of low-income housing is gonna be on R4. That's just a misinterpretation, but that's a possible. Is there any way that this particular document can be at least put forth to the Board of Trustees? And so you get the official, okay, we take their recommendations and you start working on them. Before you go any further, spend any more time, because they are the elected officials of the bunch. And I know that it's your interpretation that you're supposed to accept the recommendations from Matrix, but I get it in writing from them on a vote. Thank you.
Melissa.
Miss Whitehouse, you said page 74, you're on 74 of the packet. Okay, thank you.
Page 66 of the report.
Document.
Yep, thank you.
Duly noted, Mr. Bird.
Yep, understood.
She kept it short.
Thank you. Thanks, public. All right, anything else, you guys? Other questions? Staff's got good direction. You guys are set. Thank you very much again. Oh, communications, do you have anything else above and beyond?
The only thing I was going to or two things I wanted to communicate, and we've kind of already touched on one. The next meeting is March 3rd. We anticipate bringing this back. We are going to be posting the draft report on the town's website and allowing public review and comment. So that'll be coming up. And then we'll be bringing back kind of the refined, close to final version in March, along with some recommendations for these are the strategies that we would propose, considering in the short term. So be prepared for March 3rd. And the other component that I wanted to bring up is I believe it's in April is kind of where the calendar falls for, board and commission vacancies, or for reappointments. There's 2 members of the planning commission that, your appointed terms or appointments to an unexpired term are coming up. And I'm going to help get the information to you if you choose to reapply, for continuing to serve on the planning commission. So I just wanted to mention that publicly that we want to get those applications out for returning members and any interested members of the community that want to apply.
I know it's not me, darn it.
I'm one of them.
Bye, it's me.
Supposed to be me.
Okay, we good? All right,
We already talked about it.